Last Man Meditations, we continue Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace, the homicide detective, former atheist turned Christian, as he investigates the claims of the Gospels. He's a cold case homicide detective, Christian casemaker, and adjunct professor of Christian apologetics at Biola University. His cases have been featured on Dateline, Fox News, and Court TV. He has received an award for his work and has a master's degree in theological studies. He's a former atheist and now makes a case for Christianity using his experience as a cold case detective. Today we are in Chapter 10, Prepare for an Attack. Sometimes in criminal trials, the evidence against a given defendant is so overwhelming that the defense gets desperate to try to get their client acquitted. It seems when this happens that there's no conscience sometimes upon the defense, as they will resort to many tactics to try to get their client acquitted, even if they know deep down their client's probably guilty. Wallace tells a story in the book that he calls a joke to illustrate the point. In the fake story that Wallace tells, the defense attorney in a murder trial says he has a surprise for the jury. He says the person that his client is accused of murdering is about to walk in the courtroom and prove his client's innocence within 60 seconds. So he's trying to trick the jury and make them think that the victim is still actually alive. The attorney looks to the door. The jurors look to the door. Significantly, however, the defendant does not look to the door. The attorney admits lying to the jury to create reasonable doubt in them. Based on that, the attorney says the jury should acquit his client since he just manipulated them and created reasonable doubt. In the fake story, much to the clever defense attorney's chagrin, the jury quickly returned with a guilty verdict, convicting the defense attorney's client. The attorney was shocked that the jury returned a guilty verdict and asked why they did so quickly. The jury foreman quickly responded that when the entire courtroom looked at the door for the entrance for the real killer, the defendant never looked at the door because the defendant knew that the true killer was sitting in the defendant's chair. And by not looking at the courtroom door, the defendant proved his involvement in the crime. Wallace explains that in the numerous homicides he's worked over the years, sometimes the evidence is overwhelming, while some others are more difficult to prove. Whether the evidence is overwhelming or not, each time the defendant has been represented by an articulate, intelligent, and committed defense attorney who carefully crafted a defense for his or her client. Many of these attorneys appeared to be incredibly confident in spite of the evidence that pointed to the guilt of their clients. Good defense attorneys will always be enthusiastic and self-assured. Many factors can motivate an attorney to perform confidently and aggressively on behalf of their clients. Some attorneys surely work diligently because they have a true belief in their client's innocence. Some attorneys surely work diligently because they have a true belief in the importance of a fair and adequate representation in our criminal justice system, even if they don't personally believe in their client's innocence. Some attorneys are motivated to advance their careers. One thing is for sure, defense attorneys present the best case they can, even when they may not believe that they are defending the truth. Similarly, apologists, both for Christianity and against Christianity. Some are good, some are bad, some are well articulated, some are not, some are well prepared, some are poor prepared. Just like the defense attorneys. Christianity has an increasing attack coming from skeptics. Wallace became a Christian in 1996. Until 2001, for those first 5 years, he believed himself to be the most sarcastic atheist, now former atheist, there was. But he had not yet met some of the contemporary atheists. Now, as a Christian, when Wallace reflects back on his conversations with Christians while he was still an atheist, he's now embarrassed about how he behaved in those conversations. Many of his co-workers still remind him about those days. His own level of sarcasm was quickly eclipsed by the atheists who began to write and speak against religion following the attack on the World Trade Center in 2001. A new era of atheistic rhetoric began following that dreadful day, as prominent atheists responded to what they saw as the evidence of the evil of religious fundamentalism. A number of books flooded the shelves of local bookstores. You had Sam Harris's The End of Faith, Religion, Terror, and the Future of Reason, and The Letter to a Christian Nation. You had Richard Dawkins' God Delusion, Christopher Hitchens' God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. The attacks from atheists and skeptics grew and took on a new form of immediacy, aggression, and sarcasm. Many Christians, especially those who'd been believers for most of their lives, were caught off guard by the confidence and articulate opposition of these authors and those who shared their negative view of Christianity, much like the defense attorneys that Wallace pictured in the beginning section. The culture quickly seemed to embrace the winsome atheistic criticisms. Book sales for these three writers were phenomenal. The mere fact that anyone could offer a thoughtful and engaging defense of atheism seemed to shake the confidence of many believers who may have been taking their faith for granted. It wasn't as though these skeptics were offering anything new. Instead, they were presenting old arguments with new vigor, humor, cynicism, and urgency. They were much like the defense attorneys Wallace had faced over the years. In Wallace's experience, good defense attorneys typically bring out the best prosecutors, the best in prosecutors and detectives. So Wallace had learned to embrace the work of defense lawyers who would cause him to make sure his case is sound and reasonable. The fact that there's a defender on the opposite side of the issue who's arguing vociferously against us is no reason to believe that the defender possesses the truth. Just because the atheistic apologist can make their case with conviction and with sincerity and with high emotion doesn't mean that they are right. And of course, the skeptic can say that about the Christian too. So you have to look at the evidence. And that's what this channel is devoted to and this book is devoted to. And the next section of the book will share the New Testament evidence in more detail. Defense attorneys operate that way even when they're defending what turns out to be a lie. The existence of a well-articulated defensive argument alone is no reason to surrender our position. Just because somebody can attack the Christian position well doesn't mean that Christianity is a lie. But the existence of a well-articulated defense argument alone ought to encourage us to know our case better than anyone else. So you better know what you're talking about if you're a Christian. You better be able to defend from the skeptical attacks. Defense attorneys, just like those who oppose the claims of Christianity, ought to bring out the best in us as apologists. Defense attorneys approach each case differently. Let's look at the defensive strategy. But Wallace has noticed a number of general strategies that defense lawyers have taken when trying to defeat his cold case investigations. By examining these defensive strategies and comparing them to the approach that's often taken by those who oppose Christianity, we can assess the validity of these tactics. Defense attorneys and skeptics will challenge the nature of truth. They will not say the typical skeptic will say that truth is relative. There's a section in I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist that goes into more detail about this, and Wallace is about to go into detail about it here. If all truth is simply a matter of perspective and subjective opinion, if it's subjective and not absolute, if it's relative and not absolute, not objective, it's virtually impossible to convict someone of a crime. If it's all just a matter of opinion. If it's all just a matter of opinion and there's no such thing as objective truth, then there's no point in this discipline of trying to examine evidence and come to the knowledge of the truth. We live in a culture that's more and more pluralistic with each passing generation. Many of our young adults have been taught in universities, colleges, and through movies, television, and books that objective truth does not exist or simply cannot be known. As a result, relativism is a common feature of our cultural worldview. People are less and less comfortable accepting that one popular version of the truth is exclusively correct. And of course, that's the problem that people have with Jesus, is that he was an exclusivist, that he said he's the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but by him. In fact, many believe that such view of truth is arrogant and narrow-minded. Right. And of course, Jesus said the way is narrow that leads to life and few find it. And the way is broad that leads to death and most are on it. So that offends people. And that's why. Because the Christians, they say, are too narrow-minded. To make matters worse, a new cultural definition of tolerance has emerged. Tolerance used to be the attitude that we took toward one another when we disagreed about an important issue. We would agree to treat each other with respect, even though we refused to embrace each other's view on a particular topic. Tolerance, instead, now is the act of recognizing and embracing all views that are as equally valuable and true, even though they often make opposite truth claims. Tolerance is self-defeating because it asks you to embrace everything as though everything is true, and that's impossible. According to this redefinition of tolerance, anything other than acceptance and approval is narrow-minded and bigoted, and the Christians are accused of being narrow-minded and bigoted all the time because they say that there is such a thing as objective truth and Christianity is objectively true, and now we have evidence to back it up, and people don't like that because it confronts them in their immoral lifestyles, and they don't like that. They want to live as they want to live. They don't want anyone telling them how they should live, that there's a God who expects them to live a certain way, and that when they don't, that all of us, Christians included, are guilty of sin and have earned God's judgment. But the good news of the gospel is, despite the fact that we've earned God's judgment, God made a way for us to be forgiven, and that's through the death, burial, and resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ. By repentance and faith in him, we can have eternal life. So defense attorneys are capitalizing on the claims that skeptics and atheistic apologists are capitalizing on the evolving redefinitions of truth and tolerance. And defense attorneys do as well. If a lawyer can convince a jury that no version of what happens better than another because all truth is simply a matter of personal perspective and opinion, the jury's going to have trouble convicting the defendant with any level of confidence. If a skeptic can convince someone that there is no such thing as objective truth, they can make truth relative, they can make morality relative, and convince someone that God does not exist. For this reason, some defense attorneys begin by attacking the nature of truth before they ever attack the prosecution's case. Let's define objective truth. While many truths are certainly a matter of opinion, some truths are completely independent of anyone's personal opinion. The statement, police cars are the coolest cars on the road, may be true for me, given that I'm driving a police car, while completely untrue for you, especially when you get pulled over. This statement's a matter of subjective opinion. It's dependent on the subject who possesses it. The statement, police cars are equipped to travel in excess of 100 miles an hour, is not dependent on anyone's opinion, however. That statement's either true or false based on the car itself. Police cars are equipped to travel this fast, and one's subjective opinion has nothing to do with it. The erosion of the classic view of objective truth and tolerance is also taking its toll on those who hold a Christian worldview. The notion that there might be only one way to God or one truth about identity and the nature of God is offensive and intolerant to many skeptics and non-believers. And you hear this as you hear Christians engage on college campuses with skeptics and non-believers. Like prosecutors who face misunderstandings about the nature of truth, Christians may also have to expose the logical problems inherent to new cultural definitions. While some may argue that all religions are basically the same, that's simply untrue, and you hear that in the college campus debates too. World religions propose contrary claims related to the nature of God. Eastern religions propose the existence of an impersonal God, while monotheistic religions like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam each claim that God is personal. Judaism refuses to recognize Jesus as anything other than a rabbi or spiritual teacher, while Christianity claims that Jesus was God himself. Islam denies that Jesus died on the cross, while Christianity claims that Jesus died by crucifixion and rose from the dead, verifying his deity. All these claims about God and Jesus may be false, but they cannot all be true. They contradict one another by definition. The logical law of non-contradiction states that contradictory statements cannot both be true at the same time. There was a section in I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist about the law of non-contradiction. Those who are evaluating the claims of the world's religions, like jurors evaluating a criminal case, must decide which of these views is supported by the evidence rather than surrender the decision to an errant view of the truth. Right, you've got to look at each claim by itself and consider the evidence. And whichever view is best supported by the evidence, that's the one to adopt. And did this. Those who are investigating Christianity may want to rethink the latest cultural definitions of truth and tolerance. Those who claim that truth is a matter of perspective and opinion are proclaiming this as more of a matter of perspective and opinion. Right. It's circular reasoning. Frank Turek called it the roadrunner tactic, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. They would like us to believe this definition is objectively true, even as they deny the existence of objective truth. When a statement fails to meet its own standard for being true, it's said to be self-refuting. The claim that objective truth does not exist is self-refuting because, in fact, it is an objective claim about truth. Because there is objective truth. Objective truth does exist. And if truth does exist, then one of the things we can take from that, as you learn from I Don't Know What of Faith to Be an Atheist, is that you can extend into morality and other things that show that God must exist. The current redefinition of tolerance doesn't fare much better. Those who claim that tolerance requires all ideas and perspectives to be embraced as equally true and viable simultaneously deny the classic view of tolerance. In other words, the new definition of tolerance is intolerant of the old definition. See the irony there? It can't follow its own rules. It's just as self-refuting as the new redefinition of truth. We simply need to help people see that this is the case. So what are some of the tactics that defense attorneys take? They approach each case differently, but they have a number of general strategies that they take when trying to defeat his cold case investigations. So we can examine these strategies that defense attorneys take and compare them to the approach that skeptics take when they argue against Christianity. First, defense attorneys focus on the best the prosecution has to offer. While circumstantial cases are built on many pieces of evidence that are evaluated as a group and taken together, some pieces are better and far more important to the case than others. For this reason, defense attorneys focus their attention on the heart of the prosecution's case, the prominent and most condemning pieces of evidence that have been presented. If they can discredit or eliminate these key pieces of evidence, the foundation of the prosecution's case may begin to crumble. In fact, if I want to know what the defense thinks of my case and what it considers to be the most devastating piece of evidence, I simply have to observe what it is attacking with the most vigor. If my case is thin or weak, the defense will be comfortable attacking that one piece of evidence it believes to be critical. That's why you hear a lot of people try to criticize the problem of evil, and if Christian apologists can do well to defend that, and some do pretty well, then I think that helps the Christian case pretty well. If my case is substantial and strong, the defense will find itself trying to attack a much larger number of issues in an effort to limit the cumulative impact of the evidence. And that's what you hear. You hear the skeptic attacks come from all directions at all different points. That's why there's a large variety of topics on this channel, such as the contradictions, such as the cosmological argument, the moral argument, the teleological argument, and then the different evidential aspects that point to Jesus as being reliable and historical. The defense chooses to attack whatever it sees the biggest strengths of the case. Skeptics do something similar when they attack the claims of Christianity. The Christian worldview is built on the eyewitness testimony of the gospel writers. For this reason, many skeptics attack the credibility of the gospels as their primary tactic in trying to defeat the case for Christianity. This focused attack on the gospels reveals the strength of the Christian apologist's case. Like defense attorneys, skeptics recognize the Christian's most valuable piece of evidence. As a result, some critics attempt to undermine the reliability of the gospel writers as eyewitnesses. That's in the forthcoming section, while others seek to have this testimony tossed out as unreliable hearsay before it can be evaluated. They argue that the gospel accounts fail to meet the judicial standard we require of eyewitnesses in criminal cases. Witnesses must be present in court in order for their testimony to be considered in a criminal trial. But of course, in cold cases, many of the witnesses are dead, just as is the case with the gospel accounts. This often presents a problem for a cold case detective. Cold case detectives often have cases that are impossible to complete because key witnesses are dead, like I just said, and can no longer testify in court. It's not enough to have someone who heard what these witnesses once said about an event. If those second-level witnesses were called into court, their testimony would be considered hearsay. It would be inadmissible simply because the original witness was no longer available to be cross-examined for evaluation. This is a reasonable standard to hold for criminal trials. As a society, we hold that it is better that 10 guilty persons escape than that one innocent suffer. For this reason, we've created a rigorous and sometimes difficult legal standard for eyewitnesses. But this standard is simply too much to require of historical eyewitness testimony. So in other words, historical eyewitness testimony is not held to the same standard because it can't be, because the witnesses are not living. The vast majority of historical events must be evaluated in spite of the fact that the eyewitnesses are now dead and cannot come to court to testify. The eyewitness who observed the crafting and signing of the Constitution of the United States are lost to us. Those who witnessed Abraham Lincoln's life are lost to us. It's one thing to require eyewitness cross-examination on a case that may condemn a defendant to the gas chamber. It's another thing to hold history up to such an unreasonable necessity. We require this standard for historical accounts. Be prepared to jettison everything you think you know about the past. Nothing can be known about history. Nothing can be known about history if live eyewitnesses are the only reliable witnesses we can consult. If this were the case, we could know nothing with certainty beyond 2 or 3 living generations. Once the eyewitnesses die, history is lost. But we have great confidence about many historical events, in spite of the fact that the eyewitnesses have long been in their graves. As we evaluate the writers of any historical account, we must simply do our best to assess them under the 4 criteria we discussed in Chapter 4. We will apply these criteria in Section 2. Our goals are the same as we have for living courtroom eyewitnesses, but our expectations are appropriate to the examination of history. This is reasonable, given the nature of events that occurred in the distant past. So after defense attorneys focusing on the best the prosecution has to offer, defense attorneys also target the micro and distract from the macro. They want to make a big deal about smaller things to distract you from the bigger things. As we've already described, strong circumstantial cases are built upon large collections of evidence. The more pieces of evidence that point to the suspect, the stronger the case. For this reason, defense attorneys attempt to distract juries from the larger collection by focusing them on the individual pieces. The last thing the defense attorney wants the jury to see is how the pieces come together as a group to complete the puzzle. Instead, a defense lawyer wants jurors to examine each piece of the puzzle in isolation from all the rest, hoping that the item under consideration can be explained in some manner that won't implicate his or her client. If there is more than one reasonable way to interpret a piece of individual evidence, the law requires that juries decide in favor of the defendant's innocence. Defense attorneys, therefore, spend time trying to take the jury's eyes off the larger collection and focus the jury on the minutia, and that's what the skeptic does when debating the Christian. They take the big picture, which is overwhelming in the Christian's favor, and they find something that they think they can latch on to, and they do, and they distract people from the big picture, and people are persuaded against the truth. A single puzzle piece, when examined in isolation, is difficult to understand without seeing the larger puzzle. One little puzzle piece might be part of any number of puzzles. There's just no way to know until we see how it fits with the rest. It's the defense attorney's job to keep jurors from seeing how the pieces fit together, and that's what the skeptic does. They with rancor and affableness and just their likable personality many times. That's what a false teacher does. They pull you away from the truth with their presentation and demeanor sometimes. You've got to look at the content of their claims and look at it closely. Those who challenge Christianity's claims take a similar approach. Let's take a look at the case for Peter's influence on the Gospel of Mark as an example. Skeptics have noticed that Mark's account fails to include that Peter got out of the boat and nearly drowned when Jesus was walking on the water, according to Mark 6 and Matthew 14. If this part of the puzzle is examined in isolation, it seems reasonable that Peter had no influence on Mark's Gospel, as many skeptics claim. How could Mark leave out this detail if he truly had access to Peter? Skeptics have used this passage of Scripture to argue against the eyewitness authorship and reliability of the Bible. But when this individual passage is examined alongside all the other verses involving Peter in Mark's Gospel, the more reasonable explanation emerges. It's only when examining all these passages as a group that we see Mark's consistent pattern of respect and stewardship toward Peter. It's in the larger context where we see that Mark consistently seeks to protect Peter's reputation and honor. When we combine this fact with the other pieces of the puzzle offered in Chapter 5, the case for Peter's influence on Mark's Gospel is substantial and reasonable. Like jurors in a criminal trial, we need to resist the effort of those who want us to focus on the individual puzzle pieces as if they were not part of the larger puzzle. Next, defense attorneys attack the messenger. Nearly every piece of courtroom evidence is submitted through the involvement of a human agent. Eyewitness testimony is one obvious example of this, but even forensic evidence is dependent on human participation, a detective who first observed it or a criminalist who later examined it. So a detective or a criminalist examine eyewitness testimony. observe or examine eyewitness testimony. Defense attorneys sometimes attack the person presenting the evidence when they don't like what the evidence says about their client. And so that's what the skeptics often do. They attack the apologist because they don't like what the evidence the apologist presents says about the issue they're debating. This is why you often see a vigorous and critical cross-examination of key witnesses. Defense attorneys typically vilify these witnesses, claiming some bias or highlighting potentially offensive behavior in the witness's professional or personal life. If the defense can get the jury to hate the witness, it may be able to get the jury to hate the evidence the witness has presented. If the skeptic can get the person on the fence about the issue to hate the God of the Bible, then they might be able to get the person on the fence about the issue to hate the evidence that the apologist presents. This has become a prominent tactic of skeptics who deny Christianity. There can be no doubt that history is replete with examples of people who claim to be Christians yet behave poorly. In fact, many people have committed great violence in the name of Christianity, claiming that their Christian worldview authorized or justified their actions, even though the teaching of Jesus clearly opposed their behavior. But a fair examination of history will also reveal that Christians were not alone. Groups holding virtually every worldview from atheists to theists have been equally guilty of violent misbehavior. Atheists point to the Crusades and Spanish Inquisition when making a case against Christians. Theists point to the atheistic regimes of Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong, Adolf Hitler when making a case against atheists. Death statistics are debated in an effort to argue which groups are more violent, but all this seems to miss the point. The common denominator in this violent misbehavior was not worldview, it was the presence of humans. Right. It's not each person's responsible for their own sin. You can't blame the worldview for the sin. God doesn't judge the worldview, he judges the person. If we're going to decide what's true based on how people behave, we're in big trouble because every worldview suffers from examples of adherents who behave inconsistently and poorly. That includes Christians. That includes this Christian. I behave poorly too. I need a savior just like the one I'm trying to convince you all of. If recent history is any indicator, news headlines will continue to feature the apparent hypocrisy of professing Christians. Jesus certainly predicted that there would be counterfeit Christians, or weeds, living among those who were true followers of Christ, or wheat, in the parable of the weeds. From Matthew 13, if recent history is any indicator, skeptics will continue to use incidents involving counterfeit Christians to their advantage, seeking to vilify these people in order to invalidate the evidence itself. Right, if you can make the Christians look bad, then you can discount their faith, their religion, their Christianity. If you can make the Christians look bad and make them look fake, then Christianity must not be true. Of course, that doesn't follow, but that's what they're going for. Discourse and dialogue related to Christianity seem to be more vitriolic and demeaning with each passing year. Public debates are often less about substantive arguments than they are about ad hominem attacks. In the end, however, it's all going to come down to the evidence. That's why prosecutors warn juries about the difference between personal attacks and reasonable explanations. Tactics that rely on sarcasm and ridicule must not be allowed to replace arguments that rely on evidence and reason. And gosh, in my experience in listening to the debates between many well-known atheists and Christians, many times it's sarcasm and ridicule about the faith of the Christian. Many times it doesn't actually address the actual evidence. Next, defense attorneys want perfection. Every criminal investigation or prosecution is a serious matter, and juries understand this. Defense attorneys sometimes capitalize on the appropriately serious attitude of jurors by criticizing the fact that the prosecution's case was something less than perfect. Given the grave importance of these kinds of cases, shouldn't the authorities have done everything conceivable to conduct a perfect, flawless investigation? Shouldn't every imaginable piece of evidence have been recovered? Shouldn't every possible witness have been located? By identifying the imperfections and limitations of the investigation, attorneys hope to reveal the lack of concern and accuracy that might undermine the prosecution's case. They want to get the prosecution... They want the jury to think the prosecution missed something that would clear their client. And when you provide the skeptic with evidence after evidence after evidence after evidence, then they'll say, what about this? What do you do with this problem? What do you do with this contradiction? As though if you provide an answer for all their objections, that would somehow elicit saving faith in them. It won't, because it's a matter of the heart, not the head. Something similar occurs when skeptics point to the alleged imperfect or incomplete historical evidence supporting Christianity's claims. Why, for example, don't we have a complete set of documents from all the apostles who wrote in the first century? Why don't we have some of the missing letters mentioned in the New Testament, like Paul's letter to the Corinthian church, described in 1 Corinthians chapter 5:9, or John's letter to the Diotrephes church, cited in 3 John? Why isn't there more evidence from sources outside the biblical record corroborating the evidence described in the Bible? More on this in a future chapter of Cold Case Christianity. While expectations of perfection may assist defense attorneys as they attack the prosecution's case and skeptics as they attack Christianity, these kinds of expectations are unreasonable. No investigation is perfect. All inquiries and examinations of the truth, including historical investigations, have their unique deficiencies. Jurors understand that they must work with what they have in front of them. Either the evidence is sufficient or it's not. Jurors can't dwell on what might have been or what could have been unless they have the evidence and good reason to believe that the truth was lost along the way. Juries can't assume there's a better explanation other than the one offered by the prosecution simply because there were imperfections in the case. Reasonable doubts must be established with evidence. In a similar way, skeptics can't reject the reasonable inferences from the evidence that Christians do have simply because there may be some evidence that we don't have. Skeptics also need to defend their doubt evidentially. They need to present facts to show why their doubt is reasonable. Because Christians can present evidence to show that the Christian faith is a reasonable position to adopt. Juries must understand that there's no such thing as a perfect case. Jurors are told in advance, for example, that they will not have access to everything that could be known about a case. Same thing for the Christian. We don't have access to all the evidence. We have access to a lot, enough to make an informed decision. Judges must instruct juries that neither side is required to call all witnesses who may have information about the case or to produce all physical evidence that might be relevant. Juries are not allowed to speculate about what's missing, but must focus instead on the reasonable inferences that can be drawn from what is not. Defense attorneys provide alternative possibilities. Defense attorneys do their best to prevent jurors from accepting the prosecution's version of events. Because if they accept the prosecution's version of events, they will get a conviction. Sometimes it's not enough to simply poke holes in the prosecution's case in an effort to distract the jury from the totality of the evidence. Defense attorneys will sometimes provide an alternative theory about what happened in a particular crime, building their own evidential case for a completely different explanation. More often than not, however, the defense will simply imply an alternative explanation by asking suggestive questions that open up a number of alternative possibilities, even though these possibilities are not supported by any evidence. The goal here is to provide jurors with some way to assemble a narrative that does not involve the defendant's guilt. Prosecutors have to help jurors assess the difference between possible and reasonable in times like this, and encourage jurors to limit their deliberations to reasonable inference from the evidence rather than speculating on unsupported possibilities. Judges instruct juries to be wary of explanations that are not reasonably supported by evidence. Judges advise jurors that they must be convinced that the only reasonable conclusion supported by the circumstantial evidence is that the defendant is guilty. If you can draw two or more reasonable conclusions from the circumstantial evidence, and one of those conclusions points to the innocence and another points to guilt, you must accept the one that points to innocence. Why they say innocent until proven guilty. However, when considering circumstantial evidence, you must accept only reasonable conclusions and reject any that are unreasonable. Those who deny the historicity of Jesus sometimes take an approach that's similar to that of defense attorneys. Some skeptics have denied the existence of Jesus altogether by proposing an alternative possibility. Citing the similarities between Jesus and other savior mythologies of antiquity, they've argued that Jesus is simply another work of fiction created by people who wanted to start a new religious tradition. Many of these critics point to the ancient deity Mithras as a prime example of the fictional borrowing they claim occurred in the formation of Christianity. They describe Mithras as a savior who appeared nearly 400 years prior to the first Christians, and they point to the following similarities. One similarity is that Mithras was born of a virgin. He was born in a cave attended by shepherds, had 12 companions or disciples. Mithras was born in a tomb and after 3 days rose again. Mithras was called the Good Shepherd. Mithras was identified as a lion and a lamb. So all these things are things that Mithras shares with Jesus. While these similarities are striking and seem to sustain an alternative theory related to the historicity of Jesus, a brief investigation quickly reveals that they're unsupported by the evidence. There's no existing Mithraic scripture available to us today. All our speculations about the Mithras legend are dependent upon Mithraic paintings and sculptures and on what was written about Mithras worshippers by the Christians who observed them between the 1st and 3rd centuries. Even with what little we do know, it's clear that Mithras was not born of a virgin in a cave. Mithras reportedly emerged from solid rock, leaving a cave in the side of a mountain. There's also no evidence that Mithras had 12 companions or disciples. This similarity may be based on a mural that places the 12 personages of the zodiac in a circle around Mithras. There's no evidence that Mithras was ever called the Good Shepherd, and although Mithras was a sun god and associated with Leo, the house of the sun in Babylonian astrology, there's no evidence that he was identified with the lion. There's also no evidence that Mithras ever died, let alone rose again after 3 days. These claims of skeptics, like the possibilities offered by defense attorneys, are not supported by the evidence. It's important to remember that a possible response is not necessarily a plausible refutation. Next, defense attorneys employ a culturally winsome attitude. Most defense lawyers understand the importance of first impressions. Some prominent defense attorneys are brutally aggressive, sarcastic, and rancorous in preliminary hearings, while personable, endearing, and charismatic in jury trials. What's the difference? The presence of a jury. Jurors are not present at preliminary hearings. Defense attorneys understand that style is often as important as substance. However, how you deliver a claim is sometimes more important than the claim itself. For this reason, defense attorneys are often keen observers of the culture. They borrow mannerisms and language that will effectively endear their persona and message to the jury they're trying to convince. The facts are sometimes of secondary importance. Jurors are also advised that the words of the attorneys are not to be considered as evidence. Nothing that the attorneys say is evidence. In their opening statements and closing arguments, the attorneys will discuss the case, but the remarks are not evidence. The attorney's questions are significant only if they help you understand the witness's answers. Do not assume that something is true just because one of the attorneys asks a question that suggests it's true. Skeptics are equally savvy. Christians are not the only people who take an urgent evangelical approach to their worldview. Many popular atheists are equally interested in proselytizing those around them. They're keenly aware of what is popular, and as a part of the culture they're trying to reach, they understand what people are watching on television and on the internet. They've seen the hit movies and purchased the best-selling music. They've mastered the language and are shaping the art, music, and literature of our society. They often portray Christians as antiquated, backward-thinking dinosaurs who are out of touch with progressive concepts and current culture. They recognize and capitalize on the well-intentioned desire of many Christians to resist the things of the world in favor of God. Skeptics often have an advantage in communicating their opposition and alternative theories simply because they're more aligned with the culture that they're trying to influence. This is often revealed most glaringly in televised debates between Christians and non-believers. The most effective skeptics are those who, like effective defense attorneys, make a winsome connection with the audience. They're endearing, they're entertaining, they use persuasive rhetoric to make their points. Many times, the Christian representative in such debates possesses the best arguments and mastery of the evidence, yet seems less influential from the perspective of communication. In a culture where an image is more important than information, style more important than substance, it's not enough to possess the truth. Case makers must also master the media. When the prosecution presents a case in a courtroom, the defense is left with three possible responses. It can declare, destroy, or distract. Declare, destroy, or distract. On rare occasions, the defense declares a robust alternative theory to explain what happened in a particular case. This is difficult, however, because it requires the defense to substantiate its alternative scenario with evidence. In essence, they've got to build their case the same way the prosecution's already built a case against their client. More often than not, defense attorneys take a different approach. They focus on destroying the prosecution's case by discrediting the evidence. If they can find legitimate shortcomings in any individual pieces of evidence, they can undermine the prosecution's case piece by piece. A third tactic is often just as effective in circumstantial cases, however. Using the tactics discussed in this chapter, defense lawyers can distract the jury from the cumulative impact of the circumstantial evidence. By attacking the nature of truth, targeting by saying that it's subjective rather than objective, rather than relative, saying relative rather than objective, or relative rather than absolute, subjective rather than objective. By targeting the foundation of the prosecution's case, focusing on the micro rather than the macro, disparaging the prosecution's witnesses, raising the expectation of perfection, offering unsupported possibilities, and delivering all of this in a winsome way, defense attorneys attempt to distract juries from the larger picture. And that's what the skeptical apologists will do. They will do all of those things that Wallace has just described. They don't want the jury to see the forest through the trees. They don't want the jury to see the connected and reasonable nature of the cumulative circumstantial case. Like those who oppose the claims of Christianity, those who oppose the claims of Christianity often take a very similar approach. Like defense attorneys, they sometimes ignore the larger connected nature of the case of Christianity and focus on the possibilities and claims that are either untrue or have no impact on the evidence. And that's what the skeptic does. There's a bunch of overwhelming evidence, but people who want to discount or discredit that evidence, they focus on the little things and poke holes in it to try to create reasonable doubt. And once reasonable doubt's allowed to fester for long enough, then people abandon it completely. Let's finish with the tool for the call-out bag, the tip for the checklist. While the tactics of defense attorneys may not seem like tools appropriate for your investigative call-out bag, think of them as precautionary principles for your checklist. If these tactics are inappropriate for defense attorneys, they're equally inappropriate for those of us who are presenting Christianity's claims. Let's hold ourselves to a high standard, even as we require our opponents to recognize their own reasonable responsibilities. It's well known that the burden of proof in criminal trials rests on the prosecution. Defendants are presumed innocent until found guilty. They're under no obligation to mount any defense at all. But if, for example, a defendant in a murder trial wants the jury to believe that he simply committed the homicide in self-defense, the burden to raise this doubt falls on the defense team. Skeptics have long claimed that the burden of proof for the truth of the Christian worldview, like the existence of God or the deity of Jesus, belongs to Christians. Naturalism is the default position that doesn't need to be proved. That's fine if they limit their resistance to destruction or distraction tactics, but once they declare an alternative possibility, like Jesus is a recreation of Mithras, the burden of raising this alternative doubt, clearly shifts. Possible alternatives are not reasonable refutations. If they're not offering a declaration that can be supported by evidence, they're probably attempting to destroy or distract. Hopefully, skeptics will see the deficiencies of these two approaches. Destruction tactics that try to disqualify the Gospels would also disqualify other historical texts. If skeptics applied an equal standard to other documents of antiquity, they would be hard-pressed to believe anything about the ancient past. In addition to this, any efforts to distract from the cumulative case of Christianity by redefining truth or vilifying Christians, while potentially effective, does nothing to demonstrate the truth of naturalism. Many defense attorneys work hard because they truly believe in their client's innocence. Some defense attorneys work hard for other reasons. Some skeptics reject Christianity because they believe it's evidentially false, and they're prepared to declare and argue an alternative case. On the other hand, some reject Christianity for another reason, or perhaps some past personal experience or desire to live their life without religious restrictions. When this is the case, they often resort to destroy or distract tactics. Let's help our doubting friends or family members examine the character of their objections. All of us ought to be willing to argue the merits of our case without resorting to tactics unbecoming of our worldviews. While Wallace grew up as an atheist, many of his Christian friends either grew up in the church or lived in areas of the country where they had little or no opposition to their Christian worldview. As a result, some were shaken when they had their first encounter with someone who not only opposed them, but also did so tactically and winsomely. For some Christians, their first encounter with atheistic opposition occurs at the university level as either a student or a parent of a student. The number of young Christians who reject Christianity in college is alarming, according to nearly every study that's been done on the topic. Part of this is a matter of preparation. While Christians are often willing to spend time reading the Bible, praying, or participating in church programs and services, few of us recognize the importance of becoming good Christian casemakers. Prosecutors are successful when they master the facts of the case and they learn how to navigate and respond to the tactics of the defense team. Christians need to learn from that model as well. We need to master the facts and evidences that support the claims of Christianity and anticipate the tactics of those who oppose us. This kind of preparation is a form of worship. When we devote ourselves to this rational approach and study, we're worshiping God with our mind, the very thing He's called us to do. Marks the end of Section 1 of Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace. Next time we will begin Section 2, where we actually examine the evidence and apply the principles of investigation to the claims of the New Testament. We will begin with Chapter 11, asking the question and answering the question, were they present? Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and have a blessed rest of your day.
I see the evidence of your goodness all over my life, all over my life. I see the promises in fulfillment all over my life, all over my life.
Marks the end of Section 1 of Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace. Next time we will begin Section 2, where we actually examine the evidence and apply the principles of investigation to the claims of the New Testament. We will begin with Chapter 11, asking the question and answering the question, were they present? Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and have a blessed rest of your day.